This is the Comics Alternative on location, the Comics Canon panel at HeroesCon 2016. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek.
I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this on-location episode, we're going to share with you a recording of a panel that both Andy and I were on at this year's HeroesCon. It was called The Comics Canon Reloaded Fire. But before we get to that, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative on location is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of. And with these bundles, you can buy multiple comics from the same publisher at a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And this month, they have 45 to 50% off bundles from Marvel, several from DC, including Vertigo, and Valiant Comics.
That's right. You can find great discounts on bundles and on single issues as well. Go to the website DCB Service and see what the specials are for the month of June. Discount Comic Book Service, go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, we were on a panel last year. We recorded that and presented that to our listeners, and we're doing the same this year.
Yeah, we are. And this was a lively and fun conversation. We had a good crowd.
And long.
Long. Yeah. It was supposed to go from 2:30 to 3:30, and it went till, I think, after 4. Yeah. And so this panel was put together by Andy Mansell at HeroesCon, and he likes talking about the concept of the canon. So you'll hear him at the beginning kind of giving an introduction to the concept that he wants to talk about. And then the panelists included Mark Engelbrecht, a librarian from the local library system in Charlotte, and editor, publisher, and historians Craig Yo and Tom Heinches, as well as fellow academic Craig Fisher, who I should say in advance embarrassingly wore the same color shirt that I did to the panel, which was a kind of aqua turquoise kind of ensemble. And so that gets commentary at some points in the discussion as well. And then a couple of posers named Andy Kunka and Derek Royal.
That's right. It was you're right. It was a lively discussion. It was a lot of fun, and we had some good audience feedback. Now, on the topic of audience response, let's say a few things about the quality of the recording. It may be difficult at times to hear audience members when they ask a question. And one of the things we tried to do, and I think we did this almost every time, maybe not every time, is someone on the panel in some ways kind of repeated the question that the audience member had, because we had microphones. So that way everyone could hear it in the room, but also we could get that on the recording. Now, another comment about the recording is that the quality at times may fluctuate, and one of the things you're going to notice about 10 minutes and 30 seconds into our panel is that there is going to be a break in the recording, and this only lasts for, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or so. And the reason for that is when we right before we started to record, the tech people who were helping us set things up realized that they didn't have the appropriate adapting connection for us to record through the room sound system into my portable H5 Zoom recorder. But they said they could go get it, but it'll take a little while. So about 10 minutes and 30 seconds into the panel, that break is the tech guy turning off temporarily the recorder, hooking it up to the room's audio device, and then turning it back on. So the sound quality should be a little better 10 minutes and 30 seconds into our panel recording.
Yeah, and I haven't listened to the recording yet. I know towards the end of the panel, Craig Yo calls out Tom Spurgeon, the a creator of the Comics Reporter website, to participate. Can listeners hear Tom?
I don't know. I'm going to have to see what I can do post-production to bring the sound out, because Tom does talk a lot compared to, let's say, other audience members who spoke up during the panel. So we'll see. And, if you can't hear it completely clearly, we apologize for the sound quality. We tried to pick things up as best we could.
Yes.
First of all, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you very much. My name is Andy Mansell. I'm the person that's in charge of basically putting together the panel schedule every single year. I hope you guys are enjoying it. It's an absolute thrill for me, and I always know we can do better. Instead of paying me, they say, Andy, the last panel each year, you can do your own panel. We've been doing teaching comics panels for 6 or 7 years, I'm proud to say, and we've had a variety of different topics. Well, to me, one of the most important topics is whether there should be a canon. Now, for anybody who is familiar with this book, okay, this is the Western Canon by Harold Bloom. Is it a great book? It's up to you. I think Mr. Professor Bloom has great ideas, but he focuses on there being a center of a canon. Okay, and for you academics, please, I swear to you, I'm just trying to give the Reader's Digest version of this, all right? And it's very, very academic, very interesting, but it's sort of like in a way, the Dennis Miller of academia. You cannot get from the subject to the verb without knowing 5 or 6 specific references to what he's talking about. Rather difficult. At the end, he lists the books that you really should read. All right, unofficially the canon, and it's, as you can see, it's close to 400 books. Now, I'm not going to read 400 books, or these 400 books. I'd like to. So, in the past few years, comics have been taught at university, then they've been taught in high school, they're being taught in middle school, they're even now being taught in grammar school. There's so much. There is such a wealth of comics out there by both comic strips, comic books, comic panel. The question is, should there be, for lack of a better term, a canon, or as you termed so nicely earlier, should there be the Norton Anthology of Comics, which is at least the cornerstone for any professor, any teacher, anyone to at least start it off. And I want to point out one thing. Was that any folks here English majors in college? Okay. And I'm almost done now. This is the whole preface. I was at University of Illinois in 1983. Right? I had the head of the English department teaching we have the overview classes, right? First half of English, second half of English, first half of American, second half of American. Now, when we were doing the second half of the English, it always begins with William Blake and goes into the Romantics. It's pretty standard. But we didn't study Shelley. We did not study Burns, and we did not study at the time Coleridge. Does that mean the whole school was not teaching it? No, but at the time, it was considered, they were considered sort of slightly on the outs. Obviously, the Keats and the Byron and the Shelley were more important. 5 years later, you'd hear something completely different. The same has to come in with comics, and things obviously will grow and change. You think of the comic journals top 100 of the last century. Well, we're now 16 years past that, and that's only with only English language comics. We have to start looking at the international, or do we? So I thought to myself, I want to get a brain trust together from a variety of different sources. I'm going to start on this end, ask them to introduce themselves. Once they do, I plan on sending out one question, and I believe it's just going to start a discussion and a debate. I'll periodically throw in, but I want you to not be afraid to raise your hand, okay? Or just chime in since we've got a relatively small crowd. Everybody good with the ground rules?
Yeah.
We are, again, if things are going great, we'll keep going. Thank you guys once again so much for doing it. Please begin.
Hello, my name is Mark Engelbrecht. I'm a librarian here with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library System, and I hope I can live up to your expectations. That's quite an introduction.
I'm Tom Heinges. I publish Hogan Sally magazine, and full disclosure, I'm not an academic, just a guy with an interest in intelligent cartooning.
I'm Craig Fisher, and I teach at Appalachian State University in Boone, courses in film and comics, and mine was the first green shirt.
I'm Andy Kunka, and when I saw Craig's green shirt, I went to the bathroom and changed really quickly, and luckily I had every color in my bag just in case.
Which bathroom did you go to?
It's kind of a single white female situation.
Yeah. And I'm Andy Kunka. I teach English at the University of South Carolina Sumter, and just for a quick plug, I have a book on autobiographical comics coming out from Bloomsbury in April 2017, and thanks. And I've been thinking a lot about Canon, so I'm glad it is. And I don't want to derail this a little bit, but I had one question. Is anybody here 10 years ago when Warren Ellis was one of the guests? If any of you went to the Warren Ellis talk that went on to the wee hours of the morning, the first thing he said in that talk was, if I ever met Harold Bloom, I'd punch him in the face. So it's good that we're coming back to Harold Bloom again.
My name is Derek Royal. I teach at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I wish, like some of you, I had worn a long sleeve shirt, not necessarily aqua, given the temperature in here. I'm also one of the co-hosts, along with Andy, of the podcast, The Comics Alternative, and I'll plug as well. That's comicsalternative.com.
I'm a big fan of, if I didn't have this long sleeve shirt, you'd see I'm a big fan of the Comics Alternative. It's a great, my favorite podcast, for sure. And my name's Craig Yo, and I, with my wife, we have a line of classic comics material that we collect in book form, and we write them, we design them, we try to promote them, we sell them here at conventions, and they're called Yo Books, and that's it.
All right, and real quick, the reason why I've chosen all of these gentlemen, okay, obviously we wanted to have the academics, and we wanted academics that really love comics and really take pride in it. We wanted to have one librarian, because if you think about it now, if for comics are getting more and more expensive, and it's tough, comics are getting a better and bigger presence in all of the libraries throughout the country, and CMS really does a heck of a job with it. And the CMS also has a library panel that they do every Saturday. On Saturday every HeroesCon. Hopefully you guys will continue doing it. Now, on a personal aside, I have these two gentlemen here, Mr. Hentes and Mr. Yo. In my opinion, and again, they are certainly, if not the only, which they are two of the most important historians, archivists, whatever you want to decide to call it, regarding comics. And Tom, I don't mean to embarrass you or anything, but Tom, and before him, Rick Marshall of Nemo, along with several other people, R.C. Harvey, Bill Blackbeard, but they were so responsible for the way I look at comics, how I read comics, what I read, why I read something, why some things are important. Craig has recently, in the last few years, just come out with so much material at such a reasonable price, and it's all so much fun. And we had a panel on Friday, the first half of this comic read prints. On that note, I want to thank all of you gentlemen, and what I want to ask you is this. Let's start. If we were to go down and say, and go to the folks at Norton and say, okay, we want a comics, we want the Norton Anthology of Comics. Would you divide it by year, decade, style? Would you divide it by strip, comic book, comic panel? What would you do if this was your book? We don't have to necessarily get into specifics of who yet, but if you want to, go ahead. Once again, I'm letting them go. If you feel you need to, please chime in. Who wants to start first?
If it's a Norton anthology, then chances are it's going to be arranged chronologically. Given the premise of the Norton anthology, though, I would doubt that this would ever exist, if for no other reason, because permission costs for the use of comics, unlike other media, literary or otherwise, it's ridiculously prohibitive. So that's something that we're never going to see, I'm afraid. And we just recently got an incredible reader called Visual Storytelling, out of Oxford, and I don't know how they did that. They have a lot of great comics in that, but that's a reader. That's not an anthology as we have with Norton. So, like Hemingway said at the end, "The sun also rises. Isn't it pretty to think so?"
All right. Well, then let me twist the question. Then let me take the word Norton. I do understand what we're talking about.
Brothers in Disney are not going to help you, but so maybe we should also just like in our fantasies.
Yeah.
If they're going to be booking. Forget the lawyers. Shoot all. Are there any lawyers in here? You can leave, sir. But we're going to be. Yeah.
First of all, I'm going to acknowledge that you name-checked Bill Blackbeard, because in some ways, I feel like I and so many people work in his shadow, and, we owe him such a debt for what he did in preserving the field and promoting it. And I was talking about this panel some weeks ago with a cartoonist, and we were just mulling over what we might talk about. And we got into the subject of cartoonists. If you pluck them out of the timeline of comics history, everything would be different. In other words, their work impacted the field in such a way that everything changed after them. So I actually did some homework for this and came up with some lists. And we talked about people who changed the field include Schultz, Harriman, Opper, Crumb, Kirby, Kurtzman, Spiegelman, Eisner, Seeger. That's just a few obvious ones. As opposed to people who were tremendously gifted, hugely influential, but didn't have the same impact. And I would say somebody like Wally Wood might fall in that category. I mean, we all love their work, but if you took them out of the timeline, I don't really feel the field would have changed aesthetically or intellectually. So I make that distinction in talking about Canon.
So you actually are kind of aiming a lot at, whether directly or indirectly, at the way Harold Bloom is. So it's not just how things are; it's what came before it into it and what it delivered out.
Right. And was their work so game changing that everything changed after them? Kirby in comic books being an extremely obvious candidate.
Would that effect that the cartoonists have be negative as well as positive? I'm thinking, for example, of someone like Schultz, whose overall influence has been positive, but whose simplification of the drawing style in newspapers, some people have sort of said, well, that what's led to, along with other factors, the shrinkage of the comic strip.
I would say that he was the first one to really acknowledge the changing nature of the newspaper and the physical dimensions that they were forced to work within. And he did it more brilliantly than anyone.
Did you really think he had that design in mind, or did he just kind of draw on a simple style? And
No, I think he had that design in mind, and he designed his strip to be stackable, so it could be, presented in a vertical format.
How could you have a list, Tom, of the people who had the impact on the field and not have RF alcohol?
I didn't present every name I wrote down. I mean, I also, for example, I said DeBeck and Watterson, Trudeau, the Hernandez brothers. I mean, it goes on. I just didn't want to drone.
Mentioning RF alcohol is not droning. I mean, he really jump-started the whole comics popularity in
I mean, he's
in America.
He's hugely influential. His DNA is in everything.
Well, I think herein lies the problem, or if you want to call it a challenge, I think, in bringing to the fore this question of a comics canon, is that, as with any medium, when we talk about a canon of film or a canon of, art or sculpture or literature, you're going to leave creators out who others will think will be included in. And my whole idea, or my feeling about the canon is, on a gut level, I dislike it, and not just in comics, but when it comes to what I do in terms of literary studies as well. But I know that regardless of my feelings for that, I'm still going to consciously or unconsciously think in terms of a canon, whether I call it that or not, it's another matter. And I'm also aware of that. The canon will out in many ways, kind of like in evolution. Life will come to the fore in one way or another. So even if we dislike this idea of a comics canon and we fight against it and we rail against it and we spout off against the existence of some kind of comics canon, that there's going to be one regardless because you're going to have collections or the greatest of in a variety of different forms. You're going to have libraries that order certain authors, certain texts. You're going to have syllabi that are going to be populated by certain comics. Those are going to form de facto canons. And so as much as I have some problems with the whole idea of canon formation, it's a reality, I think, that we're going to have to confront. But it's going to raise these kind of issues that Tom and Craig were raising. Who are you going to include? Who are you going to exclude? And maybe I'm just lazy. I don't want to have those arguments. But
All right, let me take this over to Jason then real quick for a moment. Jason, in regard to... Yeah, you hear us throwing names around. I don't know how deeply into the history of comics you are, but do you think of how important it is for you to make sure your classic section of these specific things? Forget taste, forget anything.
Yeah.
It's just there's kind of obvious.
So first, Mark, not Jason, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're good. So in terms of how, when you started talking about how would this be, if there was some sort of directory to go to, I always think in terms of the user and how they're going to access it. That's my direction as a librarian. It's not necessarily what makes sense to me as a librarian in terms of being able to find it for me. It's about what is the easiest way to classify items so that as users come in, they can come in and find out, well, I'm really interested in this era of Superman or whatever the comic is. And they can walk in and we can say, this is going to be cataloged by such a whatever criteria, there's a keynote or a tag or something for that particular section. And then there would actually be completely different criteria for, say, Golden Age, Silver Age, if you wanted to try to get into those specifics. But the focus for me is always, how is the user going to try to access the content? That's how I look at everything, and that's how our catalog is meant to be set up. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the idea behind any sort of resource that's going to allow you to navigate a continuity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorite writers, critics of all time, is Roger Ebert. We could fight back and forth about this, but one of the key things Ebert always did was, hey, if you like this, try this.
Yeah.
If you like this, try that.
I thought Amazon invented that.
Then here's another question for you to please consider. Does Amazon do a good job of it? It's something we almost have to consider.
As long as they're pointing to Yo books, I always think they do a good job.
I'd like to follow up on that point because I think the word use is absolutely central here. That is, there's a couple things to say about the canon in the context of academia that are very similar to what we would say about it in the context of libraries. And that is, comic studies is a very young discipline, and most universities have maybe one or two classes in comics. And it may be, in fact, premature to try to come up with some sort of canon when what we should be doing in these introductory classes is not so much emphasizing the great works in chronological order and rather emphasizing how to read a comic strip. That is, in the classes that I teach, what's important is let's teach people about the medium first and then introduce them to whatever we might presume the great works might be. So it might be premature to talk about a canon in a field that's still so young and still developing.
That's a really good point. A lot of people don't know how to read comics.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I do in my classes and all the introductory classes that I teach. And the other point also is that sometimes you might choose a work that you might not consider to be absolutely great because, again, it appeals to the users, in the academic case, the students who are in the class. So, for example, I'm not trying to put Tom on the spot here, but almost everybody he mentioned, and I realize it's not a complete list, are white males. And, if you have a diverse student body, they might respond differently to different works that may not be as great as Kurtzman, whatever great means in this context, but the students would respond to it better because they'd see themselves mirrored in the work. And so I guess I'm suspicious of the canon, partially because comics studies haven't evolved to the point where we need a canon, partially because it's more important to teach people how to read comics, and more important, and perhaps most importantly, it's important to get people connected in comics that in ways that connect with their identities.
I want to point out to Craig where I wrote down Alison Bechdel.
I wasn't trying to.
There are a lot of names here, I promise.
But you mentioned Alison Bechdel, and you didn't mention Siegel and Schuster. I mean, I don't get it. Are we? They had to be dropped from the list to make room for Allison. We've dropped Siegel and Schuster, who created the whole superhero Superman thing.
I don't want to have a table next to Craig next year.
I wanted to jump in here a little bit because some of the things that Craig said and some of the things Derek said earlier reminded me. When I was working on this autobiographical comics book, to plug it again, one of the sections of the book is on key texts.
You need a book plugging panel.
I had
30 seconds.
And I had limited amount of space to pick out the key texts, and I wanted to limit it to about 10. I think I have 11 sections in that chapter, and I cheated a little bit because one of those sections is Seth, Joe, Matt, and Chester Brown all lumped together. But in looking at, for that, what are the things that are getting taught the most, and what are the things that are showing up, since Craig mentioned comic studies, the most in scholarship? And so as far as autobiographical comics are concerned, or comics in general, it is Alison Bechdel, Art Spiegelman, and Marjane Satrapi are the kind of top three, and then Alan Moore is in there as well. I think Bart Beatty just came out with a book. Is it with the greatest
comic of all time?
Yeah, the greatest comic of all time, where he analyzes the data, and you've got those four at the top that are getting the most scholarly attention, and then there's a really long tail. And one of the things he points out in that work, and he did a online essay on this too that's really interesting, is why isn't Raina Telgemeier getting any attention in academia? She's the best-selling comics creator around right now. She accounts for something like 10% or something or more of all comic sales, and sells 11 million books a year.
In mainstream bookstores. And
yeah,
stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's just kind of almost absolute critical sign.
Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
They're Wimpy Kid. It's the other 10%.
All those other ones.
Yeah.
Right.
The canon. So the original question, should there be a canon? And we're talking about resisting canon. I gotta think a canon's going to be inevitable. There's so many things that get the most attention, and they get attention for a wide variety of reasons. I think. When I was wrestling with the idea of how to talk about Raina Telgemeier, because I really did want to talk about Sisters and Smile and what I was writing, I got the sense that maybe it's not getting attention because it doesn't deal with the kind of topics that scholars are getting into. Like there isn't a significant amount of trauma in getting braces. Or fighting with your sister in a long car ride. It's
not the Islamic Revolution.
It's not the Islamic Revolution or the Holocaust.
Right.
And so those are the things that already kind of get attention. Those topics get attention in scholarly research, and so when a comic comes out that deals with it, that's going to naturally get absorbed into those areas like trauma studies or post-colonial studies.
Yeah. And, I want to, I guess, play off of what Craig Fisher and then what Andy have discussed in terms of using comics in the classroom. In Telgemeier is interesting because that brings in a whole other angle of market and who are they selling to, what are the means of distribution, which are vastly different from a lot of the comics that most of us may think about when we think of comics in a comics canon or the potential of that. Something that Craig said, I agree with you that it's much more effective to teach the system of comics, how to read, how to appreciate comics, instead of I don't know, either a historical approach or what are the greatest comics of all time. I mean, I think that is for me, it's something I would never do. But herein lies the problem for me. I mean, I think that over time, whatever is taught in many ways helps to form some kind of de facto canon. And as a couple of us have mentioned, a canon's going to form whether we want it to or not in some kind of loose form. One of the problems I have with these comics that Andy mentions, the big three, Mouse, Persepolis, and Fun Home, is that they seem to be taught. There's certain comics like these that are taught over and over and over again. So of course they're going to become canonical. Professors, teachers who use these texts are teaching future teachers who may not be exposed to the vast comic history that we're aware of, and so they're going to come away from the classroom when they become teachers and teach that which they're familiar with, Mouse, Fun Home, and Persepolis. Someone who begins teaching comics who has no understanding of comics in a larger sense are going to see that a colleague teaches Mouse, Fun Home, Persepolis, and others, Watchmen, and so they're going to use those. I mean, it's gotten to the point that I will refuse in my classes to teach texts such as Mouse, Persepolis, and Fun Home because it's taught so often.
Right.
And there are many times that I've thought about that, and I've asked my students, have you read Mouse or have you read Fun Home? Oh, yeah, we read it in one or two classes over the past couple of years.
And you're doing it a third time, right?
Yeah, and so, okay, I'm not going to do this. And so I think there are a lot of mechanisms that go into the choices for those of us who teach, why we put certain texts on our syllabus. One, are they teachable? Are they great examples of whatever it is we're attempting to do? On the other hand, I try to think of what's something new that will do the exact same thing, perhaps even better, that the students aren't familiar with. And so I think that's my little way of resisting.
Derek,
maybe,
what would be an example of that, if you can just give us an example?
Okay, so for instance, instead of teaching, let's say, history and trauma through Mouse, I've used in the past Barefoot Jen. Instead of using Fun Home, I've substituted blankets. And it works quite effectively. And so I think that
Kids love blankets.
Coming to, and that's, blankets actually is one that's taught often that I think is almost on the cusp of becoming canonical for a certain kind of purpose.
It will be when Autobiographical Comics comes out.
When that comes out, yes.
Do April 2017,
Yes.
in case you missed that.
You mentioned a word that really rankles me. You mentioned this word "new." I mean, to me, like something that's canonical, it needs to have stood the test of time. I don't get hearing that the teachers are just teaching all these contemporary graphic novels, and not teaching about the great old comic books or the great old comic strips. I mean, I'm of the firm belief that the only good cartoonist is a dead cartoonist. And I just can't believe there's this the tyranny of the new. I mean, it's very sad for me to hear, and very lopsided. I mean, these other great cartoonists, and we can argue over who some of them are. I mean, their work has stood the test of time, and they're the greats that these other guys built upon. But why wouldn't you teach the foundation rather than about the chimney and the roof?
I'd jump in on that. I think one of the issues, and I think Craig, you in your publishing are doing a great job to fill this gap, is availability. The tyranny of the new may come about because I can get a copy. I can get 20 copies for my class of something practical. I'd love, for example, to teach Bill Blackbeard's Smithsonian collection of newspaper comics, but that would ruin every student's backpack, I think, if I tried to offer that. Or
well, we're back to the Norton then. We need
yeah. And so I try to fill those gaps in with making selections, and showing them stuff in class. But I sometimes will teach a class that's purely on superheroes. This year, I could not get an affordable, useful copy of Lee and Kirby's Fantastic Four. Normally, I've taught like the Galactus story in there. It's not available right now. It's not in print.
It is actually in the Epic collection.
Yeah,
I just ordered it for a class.
And those are like $40.
Like $34.
In past years, the first 10 issues of Spider-Man weren't available in anything useful or affordable. Right. Now they're in the Epic collection, which again is a $40 book.
That's right.
You're teaching a class in this. You're doing 10. I usually do 10, 11 books.
And if you're working with a demographic at a school that's not that rich,
right.
It's a problem.
Yeah, and this is a big issue, availability. I mean, I agree with you totally, Craig Yo, and Craig Fisher, in that I would love to teach a lot of the stuff that may not be readily accessible or at least affordable. Another example, to build on one that Andy pointed out, is last year, one of the things we discussed on the podcast was the new collection that DC put out of The Spirit, the 75th anniversary edition. And one of the things that we pointed out on that episode, and you can check it out, again, comicsalternative.com,
April 27th.
Is the fact that up until that point, there was not available a collection of Spirit stories that we could use in the classroom, or if we could, we'd have to get older used issues, and you can't rely on that.
There's the best of the Spirit book, but that got replaced by the 75th anniversary.
Right, exactly. But I think the best of had been out of print for a while. Yes.
I was using it up until the point that the 75th book came out, and then I couldn't get it anymore.
Yeah.
And in fact, I had one semester where I had to use the Femme Fatales collection, which is not a great selection of Eisner comics.
All right, I'm going to jump in. Does anybody at this point?
Aaron.
So, I guess this question has been covered already, but I wonder if you could all talk about, what is the purpose of the canon? Do we need a canon? And if so, why? And what is it for?
Why do we need a canon?
Do we need a canon? And if so, what do we need it for? What would happen if we didn't?
I mean, again, I think it's just a kind of inevitable way in which stuff rises to the surface when these things are taught or talked about or written about, that you end up getting a certain group of things that people concentrate on. I mean, if I'm not to get off the subject of comics, but one of my favorite Herman Melville novels is called Israel Potter. Almost nobody ever reads Israel Potter, but it was a revelation to me to read it. Why is that not at the surface of Melville's canon? I mean, so it's because nobody's talking about it.
However, though, now Melville is part of, let's just call it the second half of the American canon.
Sure, yeah.
Once again, I'm sorry. I'm just looking at his Norton shorthand.
Yeah.
Because Melville is in there for Bartleby and Billy Budd and, of course, Moby Dick, that automatically, or almost automatically, brings all of these things that are in public domain potentially back to life. Let me piggyback on that and try to emphasize to you guys what the things that I'm seeing so far, and tell me if you agree or disagree. I heard somebody say we don't need a canon. I heard also you say that, hey, it's too young of an art form. I say I disagree. And the example I'm going to use...
I don't think they said too young of an art form.
Too young of an
ancient art form. Too young of a comic study.
Thank you. Yeah. To clarify.
The perfect example, and I swear, Craig, I don't want to get this on film. It's my fault, though. I'm the one. But the perfect example in my mind is more of a movie than a comic, and it's Citizen Kane.
Right.
If you sit somebody down who has never watched a black and white movie, and say, you're going to watch the best movie of all time. It's Citizen Kane. Watch it. Wasn't it great?
It's all right.
I mean, but you've got... But again,
Where was the car chase scene?
So you've got to sit there and
Right.
be... Why was it great? How can you expect me to know it was great? Then you say, well, there are some movies that you want to watch before it. There's some movies you want to watch after it. There are some movies that you have to understand the context. Now, that said also, and I'm saying this as a challenge to you guys, you gave the 3 things that you call canonical, and forgive me, it almost sounded like you guys were spitting as you were saying it, like it was not, like fun home is a dirty word. It's not, but I mean, because everybody's sick of it. Well, then I suggest canonically, if that's a word, then why not do the if, as I brought up with the Ebert thing, the if so, then what? In other words, fun home, one before, one after, not one before, one after. And then all of a sudden, we've got, to me, the foundation of at least the start of a canon.
There are 2 things that I would prioritize way more important than a canon. As I said in my own teaching at University of Comics, I completely de-emphasize the canon. And much more important to me is at least 2 other things. First, and one of the things that was brought up, is sort of the construction of the industry and how it produced what it did. So, for example, I will sometimes choose works that are not considered to be great by whatever canon meisters are out there setting up the canon, because they illustrate, let's say, for example, the way the Marvel method works, or the way in which the sweatshops worked in the 1940s or something like that, because that'll help my students understand the history of comics and how these cultural artifacts emerged from very specific means of production, distribution, and actual publication. The other thing that I really want to emphasize is the experience of reading comics. One of the things that I really emphasize in my classes, or at least I try to, is the idea of seriality. That is, if we were to put together a Norton anthology of the best comic strips and comic books, you'd be able to read them all in one lunge, but it doesn't replicate the experience that you may have had in the 1940s when you were reading, a daily Terry and the Pirate strip as it came out over the course of a month or 2. So I will literally sometimes scan in old strips and just release them to my students once a day through the platform for the class, and then they have to write about it every week. Nice. So that and so those are much more important to me than a canon, frankly.
Yeah. And also this whole idea. I think another thing I would throw in terms of the idea of a canon is, I would challenge this understanding of a singular canon. I would ask, what canon are you referring to, and whose canon? Right. Because the way that I look at, very loosely, a comics canon may be completely different from the way that Craig and Tom would from an editorial historical perspective, and how they would define a canon, which may be very different from the way a librarian would. Case in point, several years ago, I was at a conference, and I can't remember what the panel was on. It was a traditional literary conference. Someone was presenting on Toni Morrison and bemoaning the fact that she's not a part of the canon. Now, keep in mind, this is over 10 years after she won the Nobel Prize, where she's taught in classrooms over and over again. And I asked during the Q&A afterwards, well, what canon are you talking about? Are you aware? Are you privy to information that I'm not? Because
isn't the bluest eye in the Norton?
Is it?
I think it is.
That would make sense if it was, because it's short enough where it could be contained in there. But Beloved, The Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon, over and over again they're taught, and that's great. But it depends on, I think, that presenter's understanding of the canon was very different from mine, which may be different from others. And so I think this idea of a mono-canon is a problem to begin with. And if we can apply the same understanding to comics, again, whose canon are we talking about? Are we talking about a historical one more pedagogically based?
One based on the evolution of an aesthetic technique?
Exactly. Sure. One that has a lot to do with, marketing and distribution issues. I mean, there's so many questions that come into play
here. Let me piggyback on that, because you make a great point. We all have blind spots. I know I can't keep up with everything coming out that I need to keep up with and would like to keep up with. If I can find somebody who can tell me what they feel is important, and I know I respect that person or that resource, it helps me as a person who loves cartooning, because I know what I need to go seek out, and I find that enormously useful. I also want to touch on something, circling back to a point Craig made about people who had vast influence on the field that in hindsight was maybe not a positive influence. And I would say probably The Dark Knight I put in that category. It landed like a bomb. It was a game changer. But a lot of its influence is to my mind, not great. Yeah. So,
how about Jack Kirby? I mean, I wish he would have never drawn a comic.
I would say a lot of,
I mean, people talk about a canon like the best entertainers, John Lennon, Meryl Streep, Pavarotti, but then somebody pipes up and says, "How about Hulk Hogan?" That's how I see Jack Kirby, like Hulk Hogan.
If Jack Kirby never drew a comic, we wouldn't be here talking today.
Well, I would be, but I'd be maybe talking to myself.
And that would be different how?
Meow.
But if Kirby hadn't drawn a comic, maybe something else would have come up. Maybe John Stanley would have come up. He was still.
Sure. Well, that's
still
the
around. Maybe he would have come
hypothetical.
up with something that would have caught everyone's fancy.
When I was talking about if you pluck him out of the timeline, everything changes. If you pluck Kirby out, I think
it would
everything
change,
ends.
but I'm not sure we wouldn't be talking about comics.
I often play the mental game of what if Mike Manili, right?
Joe
Manili. What if he had never died?
Yeah, right.
He would be the guy probably we'd be talking about instead of Kirby, because he would have probably done all the Marvel superhero books.
And Buddy Holly may have been the one that made rock music.
No, seriously, yeah.
Buddy Holly could have filled, the Beatles could have arguably filled the void that Buddy Holly and his band were starting to point towards. I'm sorry, to the side. You were going to, you sure? Folks, questions? But
Yeah, I don't know, I kind of have to apologize in advance for like buzz feeding this, but I mean, I know some, well, anyway. There's only 6. What are the 6 issues or story arcs that you think people should read if you're teaching a class? I would like to hear that from any of you.
or all, or everyone.
Right.
What's a story arc? I'm not.
Like the Galactus trilogy, I guess. 48, 49, and 50.
You know that guy Kirby you were talking about?
I have a quick and dirty answer simply because I'm not in a class unit and I have multiple ages which I am trying to promote literacy. So it's everything from typically the boy who's a reluctant reader to perhaps the 20-something who's just returning from college but has rediscovering the library for the first time but has been reading for the last 4 years and is kind of sick of it, and we need something light and fun for them. So from that, I have to go to the user and identifying where they are, and it may be more, well, this is going to help you in terms of developing literacy, or reading as a tool, or a comic book as a tool for literacy. This is going to be, oh, you know what, this is a lot of fun, then go see that movie, and it's going to tie in, then come back and see me, and I'll give you some more stuff. So it depends on the user, and so I would probably have a different set of, start with this, and this, again, depending on the user needs.
Bone or something like that, like a gateway drug.
Yeah, so, exactly, gateway drug literacy. So that's my simple answer, for whatever that's worth. So.
Anybody else chiming in?
I would say, I'd say go with Jaime Hernandez's Locust stories and come back to me in a couple of years when you're done with it. That's a story arc, right? I mean, there's a continuing narrative, and it's hard to. I would find it hard to nail this kind of thing down.
I can't separate it from specific classes that I'm teaching and the specific use that it plays in that class. I just can't say these are the 6 that always work for me because it depends on the structure of the class. So, for example, in the fall, I'm teaching an introductory class, and I usually do a short unit on superheroes, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And this year, what I was going to do in that unit was completely changed by a point that Tom brought up, which is that I read a work of criticism that made me reevaluate a superhero narrative that I had previously taken for granted, which was Hellboy. I read Scott Buchopman's new book on Hellboy, and I was so taken with it that I wrote Scott and said, will you Skype in with my class, and we'll have them read the book, and they'll read Hellboy along with it, and then all of a sudden, that's my superhero unit, and it'll be useful because they'll hear other voices, and it will be a different class when I teach it from when I teach it in next spring, because I'll change things up, and it will serve a different function in the syllabus. So I can't extricate it from circumstance like that.
How about this, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to, I'll put this to Tom and Craig first. Name 3, 2, 3, whatever you think besides Kirby.
Kirby's disqualified, I guess.
Not necessarily that works, but you've got, just like, hey, you've got to read William Blake. Which poem? We'll get to that. William Blake's important. Can you name the 2 or 3 that you sit there and say, I believe that people who read Hogan's Alley, who I wish read Hogan's Alley, I would love them to meet or to get into the work of, or at least experience the work of these 2-3 artists. I think that might be a little better than storyline.
Well, I mean, if I were trying to persuade someone of the beauty and the power and the uniqueness of comics, I might get them to look at some prime years of what?
George Harriman, Crazy Cat.
Well, your Tiger T book would be a perfect, entree into that universe. I would say Frank King's Gasoline Alley, some of the Sunday pages from his prime years is a marvelous introduction to what can be done with cartooning. I think Winsor McKay is a genius. I don't know if modern eyes, if you're not into cartooning already, would find it so appealing, but I would.
I think his Dreams of the Rarebit Fiend would be. I mean,
yeah.
So
there's 3 off the top of my head. I mean, I could come up with countless others. Immediate post-war Spirit, I think would be a must-read suggestion.
Nice, Tom. I'm actually agreeing with some of the things you're saying.
Frank, what would you, now again, you're, and I mean this in a good way, you're very much all over the place with what you reprint. And out of all the things that I've read by you, I would guess for you it would be Jack Cole, Walt Kelly, and I can't think of a third. Would I be somewhere in the right?
No, I really, I mean, I just published a Walt Kelly book. I just published a Cole book, but they wouldn't be at the top of my list. I mean, I think I published the books because I just felt that their amazing work deserved to be seen. But I like to go even deeper, like, and possibly, and I'm not. And my whole idea about canons is like I don't like canons because it's usually snobby, pretentious academics and PhDs and librarians that put them together. So
if you don't like us,
present company accepted.
We suck.
But in a way, I'm being pretentious too, in that I really like totally unknown geniuses, unknown champion like Booty Rogers, who did the hillbilly comics and wacky, crazy stuff, and Mill Gross, who was at the top of his game in a household word, and was in addition to comics, he was in animation and everything else. But he's like totally forgotten now, and I've done two books of his to try to get people interested in it. And thankfully, like the animating community, all the animators out on the West Coast, they bought most of the books, not the comics fans, But I mean, I think he's a there's people that were never recognized as geniuses like Booty Rogers, and there's people that are forgotten geniuses like Milt Gross, and so I'd really like to see them up at the top of the canon. If we have to take off people like, Kirby or those wannabes,
right.
then let's get the really unknown geniuses at the top.
You do not want to be on the 100th anniversary Kirby panel next year.
I'd be happy not to be.
Turn this question back to Tom again. The names you mentioned are really like singular artists, right? And they stand out. But to the question, something that Craig was saying earlier, Craig Fisher, about finding something that's representative. Would you consider those artists representative of what, if you wanted to give somebody a sense of these are the kinds of comics, if you want a familiarity with what comic strips were like in that era, would those 3 be the ones you would expose people to, or would you try to expose them to some that might be more, less great art and more kind of typical of what was going on?
Gosh, that's a great question. One name that's gone unmentioned so far that I'd like to throw into the conversation is Bill Watterson.
Oh yeah,
someone who changed the field and it inspired a lot of new audiences, and was a singular talent with broad appeal. He's somebody whose work I would recommend to
I bet he's read a lot in the library, right?
Oh, God,
I'm
yeah.
sure Waterston is very popular.
With the early stuff though, one that comes to mind was something like Happy Hooligan, for example.
I'm sorry, who?
Happy Hooligan. Who did Happy Hooligan?
Well, I said Opera because
Opera.
he was the forefather of so many what became conventions in cartooning.
Exactly. I guess that's where my question is heading. Who are the ones that broke with conventions and did singular work, and who are the ones who established the conventions? And that's why, that's why Opera came to mind.
Before Opera, balloons were just kind of, there'd been balloons for a long, long time, in medieval paintings and stuff like that. But he's the one that popularized balloons. I mean, my friend R.C. Harvey just made a case like he doesn't believe comics can be comics if they don't have balloons. He doesn't believe silent comics are comics. And I don't agree with him on that. But
He doesn't think Prince Valiant's a comic?
No, he doesn't.
He has problems with Prince Valiant.
But Opera did create, really popularized the balloons, which were thought of as very lowbrow, very, kind of silly, but I think that balloons really make comics, and Opera should get his due. I agree with you. I agree with you again, Tom.
Yeah. Well, okay. I've heard a couple of you in the past few minutes use the word singular artist or singular talent, which leads me to another thought that I think complicates this idea of a canon even further. We had an earlier question when you said something about the 6 best story arcs, and I'm thinking in those terms. When we think of a canon, we think of what Craig Yeo said. Something that pretentious academics, scholars put together, and pretentious academics and scholars. Well, I mean, there's some maybe master's level pretension going on.
Pretension knows no level. You can find it everywhere.
They define it in terms of genius, right? And we don't think of genius in terms of a group of people. It's a single individual. Historically, it's usually been a white male. But what do you do when it comes to creative teams? And
which was much of comics.
So might that be one of the reasons, at least pedagogically speaking, why, for lack of a better term, mainstream comics seems to be, I think, underrepresented with what we do in the classroom, is because we're not dealing with a singular creator like an Art Spiegelman or a Will Eisner. We're dealing with a creative team that has maybe a writer and editor, but what do you do with the colorist, the letterer, an artist and a writer, but the letterer, the colorist, so on and so forth. A collective project. Now, does that exclude them from canonical, quote-unquote, consideration? No, of course not, but in a way it does, because we usually don't think in terms of a team as being genius.
Well, Eisner and Cat, though, I mean, my God, that's a name. That's a brand, not a person.
Right.
Yeah. Eisner really put his stamp on the spirit, but that was very much a team effort, too.
Right. Yeah. I take as my model film studies, which is the discipline that I came out of, but which is an analog to comics in a couple different ways. One, it's a popular art form, and second, it's a collaborative art form. And personally, from my point of view, the auteur theory is the worst thing that ever happened to film history and criticism. The worst. Because it gives all, it says, Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, when in reality they were helming perhaps the production, but there were so many contributions made by so many other people as part of the film that we ultimately see on the screen that it really distorts the situation. My favorite example of a methodology that would be more appropriate to both comics and films is in David Bordwell, Kristen Thompson, and Janet Steiger's The Classical Hollywood Cinema, Film and Form Up to 1960. A great book, came out in 1985. And what they did is they chose at random 100 films made between 1917 and 1960, at random, and explored those films to talk about the conditions of production and the aesthetic development of the Hollywood film. And that's the kind of stuff I prefer to prioritize in my class, rather than coming out with some sort of amorphous, this is great. I'd rather use those films in order to illustrate the comics that I use in class in order to illustrate how they were produced. That's much more of a priority to me than amorphous and I think ultimately subjective judgments of this is the great stuff as opposed to this isn't the great stuff.
You're reminding me of an anecdote. Once for Derek and I get a ton of stuff for the Comics Alternative in terms of review copies. I think Titan Books sent us like their Beetle Bailey collection, their Hagar the Horrible collection, and I maybe Wizard of Id, and I was like, man, who who's the audience for this? But then when I was teaching, I was so grateful to have those because I could just pop out like this is what this is what a comic strip is for how many decades
For a generation before
Yeah.
the students. or whatever, right, yeah.
exactly.
No, I don't know. I was 8 or 9. Wizard of Id. But I didn't know Curious Hero. I didn't know anything. But when I was 8 or 9 years old, Wizard of Id, that was my go-to.
I didn't mean to disparage.
No, I don't think you did this.
Wizard. Yeah, I meant that.
For a second there, I thought you were saying there was a lot of
Well, who's the audience now?
And I was like, what, am I missing something there?
The old Saturday Night Live sucks now. No, we've just gotten older. And the point is, Wizard of Id is super important to somebody, which just blows the whole Canon thing out of the water.
Yeah.
But you see, because you had said the statement, who's the actual.
Sure.
Well, who's the audience now? But I mean, I know you agree with this, but I mean, the audience for Beetle Bailey, it was in millions of homes every single day for decades, and decades. There must have been like 500 Beetle Bailey books, if not
Those
more.
little
So
paperbacks.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
had those when I was a kid.
yeah, so I mean, there was a huge audience, but now it's like
And I didn't mean I was just
out of favor.
No.
This gentleman's been waiting patiently for a question. Yes.
Well, talking about maybe trying to find comics to teach outside of any sort of canon, I'm interested in what you think makes a comic teachable, and what qualities you look for to teach comics.
Did you hear that question?
Yes. Yeah. You ask what makes a comic teachable, and how does that play into the decisions that we make? As has been referenced a few times up here, it all comes back to context. I mean, what is it that I'm wanting to do in a particular classroom? One example that immediately comes to mind is I've used comics a variety of times to teach issues of race and ethnicity. How do we define race? How do we define ethnicity? What are the dynamics involved in how this plays into our sense, both individual and collective, national, of who we are? And, it depends on what I want to do in any given class on any given semester. So, there are times that I may use something quote-unquote classic like Eisner's Contract with God. Other times I may use things that people don't know much of, like, for instance, Ho-Che Anderson's King, to teach not only, a historical figure, but also in terms of his use of the collage style and how that plays into his understanding of the historical figure of King and the understanding of race at the same time. So it depends on what I'm wanting to do in a particular classroom.
Do you ever use Crumb to teach race?
To teach what?
Race?
I've alluded to, but I haven't brought him into the classroom.
Have you?
Oh, yeah. And it usually the students, obviously you're going to have to do it with students who are, comfortable discussing some pretty disturbing imagery in class. But if you have that kind of comfort level with your students, it can be incredibly successful.
But that's an example of using something within context for a teachable purpose.
I've used Eisner to teach race.
Yeah, right.
You got a question?
Yeah, just following up on several things you guys have said, recognizing that canons are artificial and unstable, but helpful teaching tools. How do you factor in the role of larger cultural impact? Talking a lot about the evolution of the form and who are important singular artists, but in terms of impact on broader popular culture, what role should that play? How do you work?
That's a really good question because it takes us back to what Craig said, which is that Beetle Bailey has probably had a larger impact than 95% of what we just mentioned up here on the. What do you think, Craig?
Well, I don't know.
Well, I'll chime in for a moment. So I think that, and I find this with all forms of art, is that if you can't appreciate the lesser quality, then you don't truly appreciate the higher quality items. You can't go to an amazing film and really appreciate it unless you saw the turd down the street from Michael Bay, And, it's a fun movie, but you appreciate it for what it is. And so you have that action, blow 'em up, whatever movie, but you don't truly appreciate the high-end, well-written, the well-performed movie unless you've actually experienced something that's of a different caliber. And I just don't think that in any format you're dealing with, you can't truly appreciate the high-end stuff unless you've really experienced all spectrums of that particular format. So that's where I think, like the Beetle Bailey, we kind of there's some scoffing about who would want this, but I think it's a valid part of the format. It's gonna help you measure your experience as you're exploring that art form.
I think of that too. Like when I teach superheroes, I often take a historical approach. So I'm really glad, for example, to be using like the Batman Chronicles Volume 1, because that very first Batman story is not a good story, but it's not a good story in really, really interesting ways that we can talk about then the development of readership in the form. I mean, number one, almost every caption box explains exactly what's going on in the panel. So you get a really good conversation out of that about the use of image and text together, and how does that then evolve later on. And I like with that one too that every panel's numbered. So then why, to talk to students, why are these panels numbered? Because I think it's Rusty Wittick has an essay on that. I think
Arrow in the Grid.
Yeah, that was teaching kids to read, how to read a comic if they didn't know how to read.
You think? Oh, that's interesting. I'm not sure this is germane to your question, but see, I use big words like germane too. It's just to me about like the impact of popular strips like even Beetle Bailey somehow kind of mess up or make it hard to make a canon, because like again I'm a champion of Joe Shuster, the artist creator of Superman. I love his work. I think he just did beautiful, beautiful artwork. But nobody thinks he's a great artist except me and maybe some people I corral into the idea. But I think it's because his character became so big, it like totally overshadowed him, and no one thinks. It's like when I first started reading comics, it was with Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck and by Carl Barks but I didn't think that was created by a real person, because it was like created. It said at the top Walt Disney's Comics and Stories, and so I thought like, well, Walt Disney's not a real person; he's like a god. And so like, it wasn't until Steve Ditko signed his work and good old Stan started talking about Sturdy Steve and stuff like that I realized like, wow, real people do these comics, and it's fascinating to. I mean, again, you can do the canons different ways. Is it like I said, there could be a lot of different canons. Is it the best characters? Little Nemo, Crazy Cat,
right.
And Babe, Darling of the Hills by Booty Rogers, or is it by artists? Is it by Booty Rogers, George Harriman, Bob Powell or something like that? I mean, there's so many ways to make this canon, and I think it's fascinating.
It just struck me that the process of building a canon is a lot like the process, and again, I come from an academic background of building a syllabus, which is that ultimately there's only so much you can include and so much you have to exclude.
Yeah.
And so ultimately it becomes kind of arbitrary what you put in. I mean, I tend to emphasize, modes of production and distribution. Other people would emphasize the aesthetics, whatever. But ultimately, what I hope my class is able to do, and then everything about the canon and not canon will take care of itself, is instill some sort of love for the form. Because if you instill that love for the form, they're going to finish the class and go, oh, I want to read more comics. And they'll go out and read comics that, everything from Occult to Miller to, they'll read around. And that ultimately will, result in a reader who understands the form, who understands the history of the form, who understands the aesthetics of the form, and probably does it more on their own than in the context of a class.
Does anybody else have a question?
There's one over here.
A couple over here, yeah.
You guys have kind of touched on in several different points throughout this session.
Right.
But my concern would be, in terms of ultimately forming a canon, would be who would be choosing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And particularly speaking as an African American male, I noticed there's predominant of who loves comics, but I can't help but notice there's predominance of white males
Right.
doing great things, and a lack of representation
Right.
of
and a white male up here going, "Yeah, I teach Crumb for race," right? Right.
So I guess my question, it's more a comment than a question, is just how would we actually get around that so that we don't make that mistake, even though we have an appreciation for this art for one, and we want to introduce literacy, particularly at a young age, which comics can do, but you want to do it in a sense in which you can attract young readers across several different mediums, across several different color lines and backgrounds.
There's a scholar named William Foster who has a book called Looking for a Face Like Mine. He's African American, and he does museum work and things like that. And I've always been struck by that title, as something that I get self-conscious about then when I'm putting together a syllabus is, am I making sure that the students who I'm going to have in my classes in a school that I teach at, which is I think 40% African American, am I making sure that those students get to see faces like theirs so that they know what they can enter into those texts in a different way than if I were just again teaching all white characters or white writers.
I think it's tough, and this may not be an unpopular statement, but I think it's tough including Afro Americans and women's. It's tough to get them on the list of the canon because they shouldn't have been had more opportunities in comics, and not that there aren't some great ones practicing today, but throughout their early history, I don't think. Predominantly, it was a white male industry too. So, like a lot of the great work was done by white males, and women should have had the opportunity, and African Americans should have the opportunity. But I want to conclude that so you don't think I'm some kind of totally racist jerk. The number one guy, seriously, on my list, there's other guys like Booty Rogers and stuff like that I think should be with it. But the one number guy on my list, and number two is way far behind, is George Harriman, an African American. I wish he was a woman too, but
Well, you also love Matt Baker too,
and I love Matt Baker. I would like him to be on the list. So there's been great women and great. And Faye King is maybe a woman you've never ever heard of. She's one of my favorite cartoonists. She's an early comic strip artist who's
that again?
Faye King.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. She wasn't faking. She was Faye King. She was brilliantly fun.
We had a question right here.
Oh, yes. My concern was similar to his, but a tad more petty. When it comes to putting it together, comics is unique because of the rivalry between not only different types, but different sects within the different types of comics. When compiling a canon, do you think there would be some form of bias, and if so, how much?
Wow, that's interesting. So also like Marvel versus DC, was there Dickens versus Thackeray at that time?
Every canon has a bias. There is no way to escape that. And it's the same. It's a similar problem to what we were discussing earlier about the idea of a mono canon. It doesn't exist. It's like a Griffith. Same thing with this idea of trying to be as objective as possible. Even trying to take into account certain leanings that we want to work against, biases are going to come into play. Again, one of the problems with coming up with this idea of a canon.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right,
There is a question in the back.
We've got the guy with the hat.
Quick question, Dr. Fisher.
Uh-oh.
Who?
You mentioned earlier about pushing the strips out in a daily format.
Correct.
Our generation, that's how we grew up reading the newspaper.
Right.
Whereas, like my son's generation, 21st century learner, they can sit down and watch an entire season of Breaking Bad. And
Right.
go, wow, you getting pushback from your students.
I absolutely do, but it's delicious pushback in the sense that they like it. That is what I usually do. Is that when I dole out strips or things on incremental or serial basis, I make them write short papers every week where they talk about what has been added to the story since then, what new questions have been posed, what do you think is going to happen in the future? So they're fully invested in this sort of to-be-continued aesthetic. And one of the reasons why I do that and prioritize that in my syllabus is precisely because everything is available now and they can binge on it. And I want them to experience what it was like when these popular forms of popular culture were newer, when they were newer, and you had to wait. You had to wait for it to be doled out. I think they like it ultimately, but they also are like, oh, put a couple up tomorrow. No, sorry, it's just one.
Speaking of binging on strips, when I get a collection of a story strip, of a dramatic strip like a Terry and the Pirates, I find it a very odd and unsatisfying reading experience because the last panel repeats the first panel over and over again because that's how they were written, that's how they were delivered, that's how they were expected to be.
Redundant in their information.
Yeah, and to read them collected is kind of, I feel like I'm stuck in mud trying to get through it.
So do you read them one at a time?
No,
Like one a
I
day
read
or
the whole thing with the expectation that I'm going to find this eventually frustrating, but that's not how it wasn't delivered initially as a book.
That's
It was,
not how that format was supposed to be experienced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, Andy, I think it's funny that a guy sitting in the back row should probably have been up here. You probably weren't aware that he was here at the convention. I wasn't. But Tom Spurgeon created a canon for the Comics Journal, I'm sure with a lot of help. But I'd love to hear some of his thoughts and
close the door before he can get out.
Tom, what do you think about all the crap we're saying?
I'm a little, it's really scattered. I mean, you guys are all kind of speaking from, you all kind of have a reluctance to kind of embrace canon for all different reasons from your perspectives in comics, which is really interesting. Like the use that you have for canon is kind of like this untrustworthy thing to kind of push against, whether it's for teachability or whether it's for kind of defining a certain kind of value that comics have, or whether it kind of justifies your own curatorial kind of philosophy. I mean, I find individual things really fascinating. Like, I'm not sure. I got lost on the offshore theory being bad for film, and I don't know how that relates to comics. Where comics is literally like an offshore art form where you can really tell the difference. Phil Nelson wrote a really great article for that Barnaby series about how the Pharaoh Morley Barnaby, even though it looks like 99% like the Crosby Johnson Barnaby, just doesn't satisfy. And that's almost something that works really well in comics.
I think that depends on the comics you talk about.
The most interesting thing I think is something that Tom said early on, which is when he talks about the greatness. There's a certain kind of greatness and like influence that you look for in a canon, which seems to me to kind of reinforce structures that exclude people that we should maybe be considering for as canonical work. Why not St. King? Why not Barbara Sherman? Why not Oliver Harrington? Why not these great cartoonists that just because they didn't participate in the like construction and the industry and the influence and were widely read, I don't know why we can't use canon as correction to kind of go back and reclaim some of these people and not make the same mistake that history made by excluding them the first time. I'm also really confused over who are these kind of creative teams that have been left off the canonical list. And certainly Lee and Kirby and Lee and Ditko are included on a lot.
Are Siegel and Schuster on your list?
I love Joe Schuster. Who actually asked that?
I mean, that's a team. Were they on your original list?
No. I
think because you guys had a prejudice against superheroes, which I somewhat share, but Joe Schuster is just such
I would put on
light.
the EC comics too, especially the ones that Kurtzman did with collaborators.
Yeah.
They're clearly in the canon too.
I just think in general there are a lot of collaborators. I'm not, Siegel, Schuster's a lovely artist. I was confused by your statement that people don't, that you're the only guy who thinks that Schuster's a lovely artist. I think that's bullshit, actually, Craig. a large number of people have talked about how lovely this work is and how kind of.
Really, I hadn't seen that, but I'm glad to hear you. I'm glad to be corrected. I'm glad to be corrected on that point.
Well, I'm not corrected. I just have a difference of opinion there. But Siegel Schuster, I don't think Siegel was a very good writer, and therefore he wasn't on my own personal list of like literary accomplishments or literary style aesthetic accomplishments in comics of the 20th century.
Well, I don't think he was a great writer in one sense, but I mean he was so imaginative, and he pulled a lot of great ideas together from previous stuff, and so I think he was.
When you come down to it, a canonical list represents the kind of collective values of the people or the people or the one person making the list. And so it's kind of revealing. And I think that you can kind of take pot shots at doing it, but the do one is really interesting because you kind of have to put down on paper what those values are. And it's, I suggest everyone here do it. Everyone take, what are the 25 works that I think are the most important or the most valuable or the best.
Or the most fun.
Yeah.
Sure. It really kind of gets you out of this kind of circular critical thinking. You actually have to say, this one I like better than that one. And that's incredibly valuable to me as a reader.
Well, Tom, you made the comment that, the canon is correction. And, that right there, that problematizes this whole idea of canon. And, this is what's done in other media as well. When we think of, let's say, a literary canon, that's not something that was created at one point and has never changed. Earlier, Andy, you used the example of Melville. Let's keep in mind, Melville was not part of any canon, American or otherwise, until well into the first quarter of the 20th century. And so these things change, and they're changed sometimes consciously, sometimes in a very slow evolutionary manner. These things are going to happen. But that's a good point, that people use canons for a variety of different reasons, and that's fine. Again, it's going to out. It's going to happen whether we want to or not. So talking about the pros and cons, whether we love or whether we resist this idea of a canon, is in many ways it's kind of moot, because it's going to happen, and it's going to have a variety of different permutations, given context and given individuals and given committees.
I want to ask Tom a question, if I could, and that is, what do you think the difference is between formulating a canon in the way that you suggested that we do and writing criticism? Because it seems to me that what you're talking about is that, let's say, for example, that you believe that Oliver Harrington is one of the greatest of editorial cartoonists, which I do. He's phenomenal. What would be the difference between putting him in a canon and writing a long article about why Harrington's work is so important?
Well, it's different. It's different. It's the difference between doing CrossFit and becoming a runner. Not that I have any experience with it. It's different ways to get different results.
Right.
When you make those hard decisions, it gets you out of a lot of bad habits. The one value that the comic journalist I think had was not just enunciating kind of this comic journal-y view of the world.
It got people talking, yeah.
But also that we got out of this habit of forgiving great artists bad art because we were focused on the works of art. When 2 weeks before we published, Gary Groff came up to me and said, "We're going to switch this over to artists because I don't want to hear from people." I don't want to hear from people. I don't want to hear from the Toast fans. That was his kind of.
I don't want to hear from the what?
The Toast fans.
He didn't want to hear from people that kind of value, that had this construction that. And I thought that it was really interesting to put on works for the first time because it kind of forces us to confront what is a comics work. Can you look at Masquerade and compare it to the entire run of Pogo? I like the sloppiness, and I like the kind of pitfalls of that because it just gets you thinking about things in a different way. And for me, I can just say for me, it got me out of the habit of saying, "Wow, that's a great art." It's where was that great art? What was the great work that resulted out of that? As much as I love Toast, I don't consider any of those works that he made as good as Barnaby or as good as Harrington's run of the Daily World. Or it's just a different way. It's a different way of thinking about it. And I think as long as you're pushing back or kind of creating that you think you have this canon in your head, you can always cheat when it comes to making those hard decisions. And they're ridiculous decisions. Fantastic Four is better than Hot Lap. Something like that. But it's kind of force yourself to do that.
Tom, since when does Gary Groth care what anybody else thinks? I can't get past that.
Well, no, that was just at a time he didn't want to hear back a bunch of people's crap. I don't know what that was about.
What?
I said no, and we're going to do it this way. And it came out, with all the problems that list has. But they used to say, it is a list, and you're not going to have a bad time reading all those comics. Pretty good comics on that list. I wish we had known more. I wish we had known more about
foreign comics,
like a Barbara Sherman or
Jackie Orm.
Cleveland and Gene Anderson working together were pretty great things. statement of like where that magazine's mindset is, this combination of this great scripts.
I think the problem was it being called a canon, though. I mean, it's a great list of fun and interesting stuff to read. You know, some of our favorites, but to canonize these things, it's.
Yeah.
I think in some ways comics should be rough and wild and breaking rules, and it should be according to everybody's tastes and preferences, and whether they're coming at it from as a white male or a black girl, or it should be, and it should be include popular stuff like Beetle Bailey and Smile, and then serious stuff like Master's Race. And
Can we all just agree that Ernie Bushmiller is a god?
Yeah, no,
I once gave Society of Illustrators asked me to give a lecture on the 100 greatest comics. So I started off with, Bill Waters and stuff, number 100. I went all the way to the top, and I go, now I revealed the greatest cartoonist of all time. And it was Ernie Bushmiller.
Amen.
I wanted to get back to something Craig said about that Oliver Harrington essay. That's where you kind of build the foundation, right? And that's one of the things, when you talked about comic studies being so young, that's one of the things I love about being in comic studies now, is that you have the opportunity to maybe lay that foundation or be the first person to write an article about
Just
this.
take an important
claim.
Yeah,
exactly. And then look forward to that stuff being being built upon. Like I'm really looking forward to you and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're in Charles Hatfield's book about Eddie Campbell, because there's nothing out there about Eddie Campbell except what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
All right, and I hate to do this. If I could, I would buy you guys all dinner to keep this.
Can we take you up on that?
You can, Andy.
There is only about an hour left for you to be downstairs.
Oh my God! We've been here since 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Or no, it closes at 6.
It closes at 6. We got 2 hours.
Don't scare me.
What I feel we need to do right now is give everybody across a final word on whether this is what you're hoping for, a final notation on the canon. Should we do this again next year? Is there any point to doing this again next year? And I have a question for you, sir, that we can certainly take offline. I'd really be fascinated to know. And I'm so glad I didn't know you were there, or I would have been stumbling over my day one. But thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thanks, Tom.
So I'll just go back to, it really depends on the user, and it really depends on the objective of what you're trying to share in terms of the item as a literacy tool or as an academic study. You can't have one canon. It really goes back to the user, and that's obviously the focus of all my services, is just looking at the user and their needs.
My thinking is I put together a list according to creators who influenced everything that came after them, creators who worked within the constraints of the time and the industry and the society of that era. When you factor in all those different considerations, your list is going to change depending on what your criteria are. It's really tough to come up with a definitive canon.
I'm going to use my minute or so just to clarify an objection that Tom had in the back, which was that you said you weren't sure what my point was about the auteur theory, and it has to do with this panel. Specifically, I don't like the auteur theory because it shuts down often a discussion of what the text is trying to achieve. The shtick in my film classes that I tell my students is, please don't listen to the director's commentary. Please. Because you should be making your own suppositions about how this functions. You should be making your own decisions about how this impacts you instead of listening to the director's commentary and it's like, oh, well, M. Night Shyamalan meant this when he did this. And to me, I think the most useful thing about any sort of canon that we're going to create happened here this afternoon, which is that it got us to debate some important points about the way in which the comics medium work and the way in which we want to stake our claims about the comics medium. And one problem with the auteur theory or anything is if it posits a central way, the central way of analyzing any art form, it shuts down all these other potential ways of discussing that art form, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess I would just return to my earlier point too, that canons are inevitable. They're an inevitable part of kind of what we do as both readers and as critics and scholars and historians and writers and editors. So it's always a fun game to play, and I think Tom's point about putting together your lists or whatever is that's a fun game to play. It's a fun game to sit down and force somebody to have to say what are your 6 favorite things. But it's also an endless conversation. We're never going to be done with this topic. So, Andy, you want to keep bringing it back? You could probably keep bringing it back, and we could keep rehashing the same kind of things over and over again. But it is fun to talk about, but that conversation has no end.
Yeah. I guess in wrapping up, my response would be twofold. First, the Canon. If you want to discuss it, fine. There's a lot to talk about, but I think that there are a lot of other things that are just as, if not more interesting to discuss. But I'm willing to do so. And the second thing I'd like to point out is I find it mighty curious that about every single example we've brought up today represents comics produced in North America. No one's brought up manga. Well, I mentioned Barefoot Jen earlier. No one's mentioned, I don't think, European comics. And so I just want to throw that out there.
Well, I just want to spend my time to say I apologize, Tom. And
You're forgiven.
And to the audience, too, because I really don't know what the hell I'm talking about. From the get-go, I thought this was a panel about Freddie Boom Boom Cannon. But I would like to leave you with this one last important thought, that Tom and I are at booth 1510 downstairs, and we hope you can continue the discussion, maybe buy some of our stuff down there.
That's right.
And I'm going to give the last word, because again, this was the way Sheldon Drum paced me. So I really appreciate all of you being part of this. I'd like to do something at least similar to this next year and how the year's going by. We hope you will join me. A couple things I do want to tell you, though. I assume most of the people in this room are probably already fans of the books, but if you don't have any of Yo's books, if you don't have any issues of Hogan's Alley, please stop down. You will thank me forever.
Yeah.
Want to thank Tom Spurgeon for stopping in. The one thing, though, I do want to toss you just to mull over is this. As things get trickier and trickier, we don't want to offend people. We don't want to exclude people. You're right. Dead old white guys, I can't help thinking that something along the lines of a canon done properly can actually prevent that. That it was something, and instead of it being, the black artist section, I can say to you proudly this weekend, we had 6 panels that were all women on it, but we only listed 2 as women in comics. We had an entire African American panel. Didn't mention it. I'm not saying this self-congratulatory. I'm saying we are working hard to move forward. And I honestly think something like a canon, as difficult as it is, and does keep the discussion going, I think you're right, inevitable. And I think it is essential because, more than anything else, there's too much out there, right? How many of you have got 500 things in your Netflix queue that you're never going to get to?
Right.
It's just the way we are, and we are now this mass-consuming society. I want to thank these gentlemen. This was better than anything I could ever imagine, and I hope you all have a great weekend, and we hope you come back.
Andy, we would like to thank you. You're a great enthusiast for comics and creators and everything. We thank you for all your great panels you put together this weekend.
Yeah. Hear, hear.
So that was a fun panel, and I'm glad we were able to make a recording of it.
Yeah. I always enjoy when Andy Mansell invites us to participate in those panels, and so I was glad to have that opportunity again.
Right, and you're right. He is very interested in talking about the idea of comics canon. I mean, not only did he keep coming back to this in at times almost goading us in a variety of different ways during the panel, but he mentioned both at the panel and then to each of us at different points during the conference outside of the panel that he wants to do this again and again.
Yeah. So, if anybody gets sick of hearing about the canon, they can talk to Andy about that.
That's right. But we had a good time, and we hope you had a great time listening as well. And, if you want to find great discounts on the kind of great comics that we brought up during the panel discussion, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. So go to dcbservice.com. You're going to find every single month great discounts that are unbeatable. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message from the comfort of your own computing device. It's really easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can also contact us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to our blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. But you can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. You can also listen to us on Spotify, and if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can always find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And do let us know what you think of this panel discussion. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah.
Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.